Hello and welcome to Roundtable. A certain class of Russian businessman has been the subject of global fascination and critical scrutiny since emerging from a crumbling Soviet Union in the 1990s. These so-called oligarchs shared the spoils as public assets from across the region transferred into their private hands, their extravagant tastes, and it all became the stuff of modern-day legend. Very good to have you along. I'm David Foster. Well, some of Putin's closest friends have enjoyed pretty opulent lifestyles in Europe's capitals on European waters, using the billions made from interests in energy, heavy industry, and banking to acquire real estate, luxury yachts, and even finance vanity projects such as top football clubs. Both the United States and European governments said in March they thought these super rich were financially supporting Putin's military ambitions. And things are now getting difficult for them as access to their vast wealth is restricted from Europe and beyond. According to VOA, that is the Voice of America, the European Union has sanctioned more than 1,000 Russian people, including more than 30 oligarchs, since the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine. The sanctions consist of travel bans and asset freezes that effectively stop individuals from entering EU countries or accessing their bank accounts in Europe. Around 10 billion euros worth of assets belonging to Russian citizens have been frozen so far. The European Union is enforcing these restrictions via what is called a freeze and seize task force set up in the spring. The European Commission is also proposing new rules on asset recovery and confiscation. But how effective have these penalties been in stopping Putin so far? Are they merely a mix of symbolism and wishful thinking? Let me welcome to our studio Zach Meyer, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Reform. We go to Brussels, and there we see Peter Stano, EU Foreign Policy Spokesman, and also in our studio, Ignat Ostanin, Investigative Journalist of British and Russian descent. Peter, I'm going to come to you first. A few quick-fire questions. Are these sanctions against the oligarchs working in any way?
Hello, and thank you for all these questions. Well, of course, we hope that our sanctions are working, because the idea of the sanctions, and it's not only sanctions against oligarchs, it's wide-ranging sanctions on important sectors of the Russian economy. The aim of these sanctions is to achieve the change of the behavior by Putin in order to stop this brutal, murderous campaign he is leading now against Ukrainian people. So the sanctions are only one of the tools we are using, and the aim of this tool is to achieve the change of behavior.
I understand that completely, but the question still remains, are the sanctions against the oligarchs in any way affecting the behavior of the Russian leader?
Well, we want to say that yes, and we want to see that yes, sanctions are a tool which shows its full effect only over time. This is not short-term tool. It's a tool that brings effects and makes the effects visible mostly in the mid and long term. We see already not only about the oligarchs whose assets have been frozen in Europe, and we are talking about dozens of billions of euros which have been frozen so far in the European Union. But we are also talking about hundreds of billions of frozen transactions. We are talking about the percentages in drop of the imports or exports when it comes to materials and products either being shipped to Russia or from Russia. We are talking about the wide-ranging sanctions on the financial sectors, on the technology sector in Russia. So yes, there are some effects which are immediately seen. For example, also the withdrawal of foreign companies. Together with them, it's also foreign investment.
I get you have hope that you want these to work in the long term, that you are ambitious about the fact that they may work eventually. But I'm asking today about specifically oligarchs and the fact that in March of this year, both the US and the European Union put out a statement saying these people were specifically funding Putin's military machine, making it possible for him to wage this conflict. First of all, what evidence was there that that was the case?
Well, it's not only the oligarchs who are funding it. That's why we
No,
are
but you mentioned specifically the oligarchs in the statement, and that is what this program is about.
Others. Yeah, among others. But I mean, I think no one is in the illusion that it's only oligarchs financing him. I mean, it's the whole economy which is gathering resources and financing it. But of course, I mean, when it comes to oligarchs, of course, these sanctions are applying on assets in the EU. So whatever they have had in the EU was frozen. As I said, by April, only by April, based on the reporting from approximately half of the 27 member states, several dozens of billions of euros have been frozen. Of course, does it stop the war? Of course not, because Putin was preparing for this war for years. So even if we would impose the most draconian sanctions, he would not stop, and he will not stop today. He will not stop tomorrow. But eventually he will stop. He has still relatively enough stocks and reserves to keep on going for a few weeks, maybe months, but he is depleting his reserves, both financial, military, and economical. So the sanctions from our point of view are working, but we need still more time to see the full effect of those sanctions, both on oligarchs and on the whole Russian economy.
In reality, you cannot provide any evidence at the moment that they are working. You are just hopeful. We're going to leave it there, and I'm going to hear now from somebody I'm pretty sure you know, who's the European Commissioner for Justice.
We have organized a way to freeze money, so it's an administrative process by the treasuries in all the member states, and this is why I said it's for a total amount of 13.8 billion euros, but that's the way to freeze. So the property is still in the hands of the oligarchs and the entities. It's just an administrative process, but it's also possible to go further and to organize with a judicial process a way to seize the same kind of assets.
Peter, thank you. I want to come to you two in the studio here. Iggy, you first of all. Do you find that reassuring, or do you think it's rather woolly?
Sanctioning them is more in tune with a kind of outdated view of Russia, which is kind of more from the 1990s, where you have these kind of barons who, have the ear of the president. I think these oligarchs have kind of become slightly outdated figures. Most of them made their money in the 90s.
But they still have money, and they're still pretty influential. We saw Roman Abramovich trying to broker some kind of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in the early days of the conflict. I'm going to run through a list now. He made his money in steel and oil, had to sell Chelsea Football Club, London properties, sale blocked. His stake in Evraz, well, that's been frozen. Then there's Igor Sechin. We're just using three examples here. Chief exec of the oil company Rosneft. Now, he's suggested to be Putin's unofficial number 2. He's on the US and EU sanctions list. They've seized his boat in France. And Vladimir Potanin, second richest man in the country, paid for Sochi 2014 Olympics. These are all people who have influence, or are you saying it's gone?
I think that actually, if you look at sort of what the right-wing kind of nationalists are saying in Russia, and these have been kind of a driving force behind the war, they want to see these oligarchs in prison. They want to see them. They have been welcoming international sanctions against them for years because they have seen, especially with Abramovich, they have seen him as taking Russian wealth and frittering his away in London.
But do you have evidence that he or others were actually using their enormous wealth to encourage Putin, perhaps, to launch the special military operation that he did, or whether, in fact, they were helping to finance?
I would say that basically almost all of the oligarchs in Russia, all the billionaires and senior businessmen were against the war, but I don't think that their influence had any effect, and because it just doesn't. I think that the real people who are behind the war are Vladimir Putin, and genuine people around. He's the inner circle that he has more recently built around himself are people like his ex-bodyguards. They're people that he has basically promoted kind of out of nowhere. They're not big businessmen. He meets the businessmen once a month, and they have to kind of do his bidding. But
so in a sense, would you suspect, Zach, that this is more about showing to the outside world that you're targeting particular people rather than hoping that your targeting of them will have a material effect?
That's right. I think when you envisage sanctions, they can have multiple different types of objectives, some of which are kind of signalling, sending a message, trying to deter, kind of coercing a country to change course or change its policies. and then kind of constraining to reduce its ability to carry out damaging policies in the future. And I think if we're going to try to justify sanctions against the oligarchs, it very much has to fall into this idea of seeing them as signals and as messages. That's partly to Western audiences to show that, you know, what's taken place in Ukraine needs to be responded to. But also, it may have a deterrent effect when future regimes in other countries might also look to breach international law. So I think it does have some value, even though I'm certainly with Iggy in thinking that there's not really much sign that oligarchs have a lot of power in Russia at the moment. There's very few who have been very vocal
Well, quite
recently.
a few of them have mysteriously fallen out of
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. The ones who have been vocal about opposing the war have, in some cases, kind of come to mysterious and unfortunate ends. So I am kind of sceptical about those particular sanctions changing the course of the war. Although, of course, as Peter has said, there is a much broader range of sanctions that
well, I think
the
maybe
EU
we
and the
need
West
to talk
have,
about that,
sure, yeah.
right now. And Peter, we've gone through the oligarchs. The suggestion is that they aren't as powerful as perhaps some people might have liked, that it's window dressing in a way that they are targeted because they are the visible sign of massive wealth in the country. But what about the other sanctions as well? Which ones do you think have had the most effect on Russia's economy? Because they're still making billions and billions out of selling oil and gas.
Well, when it comes to sanctions, we see them as a complex. We are not dissecting them into individual sanctions and trying to see like, okay, how effective is this one? It's about the complex effect. And let's not forget, it's not only 27 member states of the EU imposing these sanctions, either personal sanctions with the oligarchs, if you want, or sectorial economic financial sanctions. It's also our partner countries. So today, overall 40 countries, basically the most wealthy and most advanced countries around the world have introduced these sanctions. So we are looking at the combined effect of the sanctions, which are diminishing Putin's ability to finance the war, despite the income you are mentioning, because he is taking a huge, huge hit in his income on other fields, exports, imports, technologies, investment, etc., etc. And also what is very important to bear in mind is that the reputation worldwide, people are not only following the sanctions, but people are also deterred by the sanctions. Even the countries who did not introduce the sanctions, they are very worried about doing business with Putin now. And those who do, let's take the countries who are importing now the excess oil or gas from Russia, they are getting it at big discounts. And it takes so much time to get it. So as I said, this is why we need to take some kind of distance and see from above and from perspective of longer time, several months, or even like in case of this invasion, maybe at the end of the year or next year, we will have a better picture how these sanctions are really affecting Putin's regime and Russia's economy, because this is about ability of Russia's economy to modernize, to continue provide equipment and ammunition, so to speak, for the war in Ukraine. So this is a combined effect of all the measures taken.
I'm going to ask the two guys in the studio with me if they have any particular questions that you'd like to throw in Peter's direction. Iggy? All right, you think about it. But Zach, I know you have.
More of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
But just to agree that I think that the technology restrictions on what Russia is allowed to import are going to have a huge effect in the medium to long term. You know, we're already seeing reports that Russia can't replace its tanks because they rely on certain types of equipment that are only available in Europe. And of course, over time, Russia may be able to find ways around that. You know, maybe getting kind of clandestine imports from countries that are prepared to be a bit more mercantile about it.
But these have to be parts that would work with the current military setup in Russia.
Exactly, and that will take time. So
somebody would have to tool up. If it were to be China or if it were to be India, they would have to make the presses and the machines that could supply these parts.
Yeah, even on computer chips, it's not as easy as simply taking Chinese chips if they became available to Russia. There would need to be
Taiwanese ones if China takes over Taiwan.
Exactly. So the amount of retooling that would be required would be hugely disruptive and expensive to Russia. And at the same time, Europe has got a plan now to quite radically and quickly decrease imports of Russian fossil fuels. And that's going to make a huge difference to the balance of payments in Russia.
Do you think it's very much a question of time, Iggy, then when it comes to this? Because if the sanctions aren't going to bite until the end of next year, perhaps even later than that. And the conflict drags on until then, or perhaps even longer. Notwithstanding the fact that the Russian military machine may be degraded by then, that's a long time to wait to see the effect.
Well, you know, when I speak to Ukrainians, generally speaking, people in the UK might be surprised to hear this, but they are full of admiration for the UK government and the US government for supplies of NLAWs and HIMARS and Javelins. But they're very negative about the EU, they're very negative about NATO and the UN. And I think that the sanctions, they're not against, but they don't think that they have the time, you know, because the months that have been spent fighting have been devastating.
Well, we're talking about something that's been going on for 7 months.
Yeah.
Now, if we're talking about till the end of next year, then that is another 15 months. What do you make, Peter, of the fact that Iggy is suggesting that people he's spoken to are a little critical of the European Union sitting back and just saying, OK, well, you know, it's going to take time, it's going to take time, when they are defending their homeland and hundreds, if not thousands of them are dying over the course of the month?
Well, the feedback we are getting, it's quite different. Just yesterday, we had the Ukrainian Prime Minister in Brussels for the annual meeting of the so-called, we call it Association Council. He was very appreciative of the EU support because it's not only sanctions. As I said at the start, sanctions are just one element of our response. Another element of our response is huge financial, economic, humanitarian, political, diplomatic support to Ukraine, and also military. The EU has financed deliveries of weapons worth 2.5 billion euros until now. This comes on top of individual bilateral weapons deliveries by the EU member states. So it's not true that we are just sitting and waiting until sanctions start to bite and slow down Putin's aggression. But we are helping Ukrainians actually also together with UK, with the US and other partners to provide them also the weapons that they need. And actually, thanks to this, but also thanks to the sanctions, Putin was not able to deliver on his aims. He didn't take Kiev. He had to retreat and he had to go over and rethink his strategy and basically be dug in the east and the south of Ukraine, and he is not progressing. So the sanctions are bringing effect, as does our support to Ukraine in military.
Well, I don't know how you can say the sanctions are doing this, that, or the other, when earlier you've said you can't tell if the sanctions are doing anything yet.
Again, I said the full effect of the sanctions will be visible. But we are seeing already impact of some sanctions already. And let's take the latest spat about the Nord Stream 1 deliveries of gas.
This is Russia the one that Putin's just turned off, saying it needs some repairs and is refusing to turn back on.
And then he said, actually, it's not about technical issues, it's about West having to scrap the sanctions. So if the sanctions are not biting, why is he demanding us to scrap the sanctions? The same was with the Ukrainian grain deal. He blocked Ukrainian exports of food and agricultural products, saying we need first to scrap our sanctions, and then he will allow the exports to proceed. So this is a sign that the sanctions are biting him, that they are bothering him.
But I would imagine, I would suggest that he's rather hoping that the economic and social impact of the lack of gas and oil in the winter hurts Europeans so much that the effect of sanctions on him in Moscow is outweighed by what the Europeans feel about the discomfort they're having to go through. Is that fair assessment?
Definitely. I mean, he is a gambler. He was gambling right from the start, and he made huge miscalculations. So he wanted to occupy, colonize, and destroy Ukraine within 1 week. He didn't succeed. He actually pushed Ukraine deeper into Europe. He generated unprecedented levels of support, both from the EU and from the US and transatlantic partners for Ukraine, including military supplies. Imagine just a few years ago, EU supplying weapons somewhere. This was unthinkable. So he miscalculated, and now he's also gambling on the anticipated social unrest or unhappiness with the possible impact of cut-off of the fossil fuel deliveries to Europe. But again, we cut off the import of coal already. We will phase out imports of 90% of Russian oil by the end of the year. We are finding alternatives for gas supply. So it's just a question of time when we will basically not be needing these dirty fossil fuels from Russia anymore. And then he will have problems to sell them somewhere else.
We're going to hear from one particular arm of law enforcement right now. And then I'll ask you about how difficult it is to follow the money. This is from the Guardia di Finanza, the Italian financial police. Just a little bit of a statement they put out. We couldn't use bugs and similar tools that you would use in a criminal investigation, but the point is that we know how to follow the money in transnational investigations. That's in Foreign Policy magazine. A lot of people playing different roles in this. Is that the way you would hope it would work?
Yeah, I mean, look, enforcing sanctions, particularly against oligarchs when you're looking at kind of asset freezes, it's incredibly difficult, time-consuming and labour-intensive. We've got evidence that oligarchs have been using shell companies, moving their assets around, giving them to friends and family, and using all sorts of tricks to make it extremely difficult for law enforcement to find them. I know that the EU has formed a task force now to coordinate the different member states in helping to do that, but it is an exceptionally difficult task. The EU, or the West, has frozen kind of dozens of billions of assets in the EU, but I think that there's been studies in the last couple of years showing that actually very rich Russians have up to kind of 800 billion of assets in the EU. So clearly we've only looked at a small fraction of those. And so I think the success of these asset freezes is still not especially clear.
Is it against the law to take this money now, the frozen assets, and use it to either buy weaponry for Ukraine or to help to rebuild the country? Does it have to sit there, if you like, unused until this is all settled, or can it be used tomorrow?
Yeah, so that's the current situation. The sanctions allow for the freezing of assets, but not their seizing, so that they can't be kind of liquidated and sold off to support, either to buy weapons or to support the rebuilding of Ukraine. But there's a lot of thinking being done already about how exactly we can move from freezing to seizing. And the EU has a couple of plans. It's quite difficult, and the UK has had a regime that has tried to do this. It's called unexplained wealth orders. And they found that a lot of the time these get challenged in court and get overturned. And so there is a need to proceed quite carefully to make sure that we don't have a similar situation here where it all gets tied up in courts.
Well, I'll ask Peter about that before we wrap up the programme, which is only a couple of minutes. But Iggy, I wanted to ask you, I mean, what particular surprises have you come across in your investigative work with regards to this, the hidden money?
I think that it's been frustrating to see a lot of focus in the media and on social media in the UK to be on oligarchs and the idea of kind of dark Russian money being everywhere. I think that there have been, I've seen examples of oligarchs who have left the country, years ago, or have actually invested in kind of Putin-critical causes, and they kind of get lumped in with Putin's cronies.
So don't think of every oligarch as a monster.
I think so, because actually I think that there's a lot to be, a lot of Russians are saying this, that we want the oligarchs to be brought back, to have their assets confiscated because they have taken this money from the Russian economy. And it's like, in fact, there's this idea that Russian oligarchs have just been, secretly influencing Western politics. I think in reality, they've just propped up Western economies at the expense of the Russian economy.
Yeah, well, there you go. Peter, let's get round to seizing of assets and freezing of assets. How far down the road are you as part of the European Commission in making sure that this money can be used now for the benefit of the people in Ukraine, et cetera, or are these very rich people always going to be one step ahead?
There is no decision so far about confiscating the amounts. As you said previously, I mean, this is a very, very intense debate with many, many tricky aspects from the legal point of view. But at this stage, the EU decisions are talking only about freezing these assets and making it impossible to any EU subject to provide financial funds to those people who are being sanctioned from Russia. There are calls from member states, from political parties, from the European public, from Ukraine to use the confiscated assets, not only of oligarchs. I mean, we froze half of the Russian foreign currency reserves. They are frozen. It's like 300 billion euros.
Yeah, but why not? I know discussions here and slow here. Why not just get on with it?
Well, because it's a legal issue, and for that, I mean, in terms of European Union, we need a legal decision, and a legal decision needs to be prepared in a proper way. And so far, no such decision have been taken, and there is no consensus among the member states that we should go down this road, mainly because this is not the biggest priority. Now, the biggest priority is to stop the war, help Ukraine to win against this brutal murderer.
But
and
some
aggressor.
would say, Peter, and appreciate your time, that you stop the war by freeing up the money so that Ukraine can buy the weapons to end the conflict.
Yeah, but the discussion in the European Union is not about using the confiscated assets for weapons deliveries. I mean, we are delivering weapons anyway. We still have enough resources to do that, and we will continue to do that as long as necessary. We are talking about the reconstruction of Ukraine, about the damage inflicted by Russia to Ukraine. So, and this will need to be discussed and clarified how this will be financed, and Russia will be called to pay its share on it for sure.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. It's a very, very complicated business. Sorry if you felt I was putting pressure on you, but we just want answers, like everybody seems to, particularly the people of Ukraine. Thank you very much, Iggy. Thanks, Zach, for coming on the programme, taking the trouble to come here to the studio. And to you, thank you very much indeed for watching this edition of Roundtable. Until next time, from me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, goodbye.